The case interview is one of the most intimidating portions of the interview process for students and graduates interested in the field of management consulting. There's a lot of information out there online, but a lot of it is either outdated or too theoretical, bogs the reader down with too many details, or is just downright unhelpful or requires a cash payment upfront, which is just not an option for a lot of students. I'm a current associate at BCG, and in this video, I'm going to talk you through exactly what you need to do to succeed in the case interview. Let's get into it. So in the beginning of every case, you're always given a context and a situation, you're given a client, and you're given a problem that they've hired you as the consultant to solve. There's a 3-step framework that you can always follow that will work with every single case that you are ever given. And it starts with first restating the problem and all the information that you've heard. Second, asking any clarifying questions. And then finally, developing your own unique framework to solve this situation. And I'll talk a little bit about all three. So with the first one, which is restating the question and the situation, this is really important because it's not just for the interviewer to understand that you have heard them and understand the problem, but it's also for your own understanding and to really solidify the knowledge that you've just heard into your own memory. And the second piece, you always want to try to ask at least one clarifying question because it not only demonstrates that you are listening critically and that you've thought of certain things that might need clarification, but it also helps with your own understanding again, as I mentioned with restating the entire problem. And once you come up with one clarifying question, you might actually start thinking of other things as well. It also buys you some time to think about how to approach this situation. So once you've asked your clarifying questions and you've restated the problem, then you want to develop a framework. And before you do that, you always want to tell the interviewer, okay, great. Now I'm just going to take a few minutes to structure my thoughts. And they'll always say yes. And you can feel free to take a minute to a minute and a half to come up with a framework. I could make a whole other video on how to come up with frameworks. But the bottom line is you want to spend at least maybe a minute to a minute and a half developing this framework. And then immediately afterwards, you want to tell the interviewer, okay, so this is how I'm thinking about the problem. And then you're going to walk through your framework and say, for example, first, I want to understand the customer. Then I want to understand the competition. Then I want to understand the product that this company makes. And finally, I want to also understand a little bit better the company itself. And then go back and walk through each of those 4 buckets and tell the interviewer what sort of questions you would ask to dig a little bit deeper into each of those buckets. Now, typically after the first part of the case, which is developing the framework, you'll often run into a quant portion of the case. And this usually comes as the second or third part of the case. And typically it's going to be something like a market sizing question, or it's going to be potentially a break-even analysis or some other type of question that involves you gathering a bunch of information and putting together some calculations to ultimately come to an answer. The first thing you always want to do, again, after they've given you the context of the next problem, is you want to restate any and all information that you've just heard. Now, you don't want to restate it exactly, but you do want to kind of paraphrase what you've heard. And if there are any numbers that they just gave you, like cost figures, you definitely want to confirm that you've heard those numbers correctly because you don't want to start doing a bunch of math if you have the wrong numbers. And before you even start doing math, you also want to just maybe ask for 30 seconds, and develop a very quick framework for how you're going to approach this problem. And after you've done that, say, hey, so this is how I'm thinking about it. I'm first going to start with this, and then I'm going to multiply by that to get to this, and blah, blah, blah. You basically want the interviewer to see your thought process and to understand that, you're going down the right track, because you also don't want to do a bunch of math and then end up at the wrong answer using a totally incorrect methodology. So only once you've gotten the interviewer on board with the way that you're going to approach this problem, do you then do the actual math. And the best practice is probably to walk them through your calculations, but if it's too difficult to do that, then just try to finish your calculations pretty quickly and then talk them through what you just did on paper. For math, I would definitely recommend just getting comfortable with mental math, being quick with multiplication, addition and subtraction of large numbers, also just understanding percentages very well, and the tricks that you can use to get to quick calculations. If you're curious about how to get better at these mental math problems, I definitely recommend checking out Rocketblocks, which has a very good platform for mental math drills and just a lot of tricks for people who are looking to improve their mental math abilities. Once you've done the quantitative portion of the case, at this point the case is probably coming to an end, or maybe there's a small brainstorming section afterwards where the interviewer will just ask you to come up with a bunch of ideas given all the information that you learned so far about the client. And I wouldn't sweat this one too much, just have a few ideas, throw them out there, but understand that the interviewer is really looking to just see that you've thought through a lot of different options and that you understand, the business given all the information that you've learned today. And this will be followed by the end of the case, which requires synthesis, which is just gathering all the findings that you've learned today and combining them into a single recommendation for the CEO or whoever the client is. And for this, I would definitely start by always restating the context of the problem and who the client is and what they're looking to solve, and then talking through some of the key findings that you've learned, whether it is some key ideas about the company or potential strategy for them, or numbers that you may have determined from the quant portion of your case. And then finally, I would follow up with a recommendation for what you think they should do. And you should always have an opinion, whether or not you think it's right or wrong. And just say, given all this information, I would recommend X, Y, or Z. And keep it short, keep it concise, keep it usually under 30 seconds if you can, and just remember to deliver it with confidence. And the other thing is that you always want to remember to propose a few potential next steps, whether it's things that you would look into further or things that the client should do to better understand the situation. You always want to come up with recommendations for follow-up steps after you've done this case. So in terms of some practical tips and best practices that I've found from my experience doing a lot of cases, what I found is that during the case, one thing I would highly recommend is putting a circle or a star next to any key findings that you discover as you progress on this case. Usually these will be things like key numbers or key ideas the client really likes. I would definitely circle or mark them somehow so that later on at the end of the case you can come back to them really easily and quickly and add them into your final recommendation. Now, my second recommendation would be that whenever you're stuck or really don't know how to approach a problem, I would always recommend starting by restating all the information that you've just heard or, giving your initial reaction. So you can just tell the interviewer hey, okay, this is really interesting. My initial reaction of this data that you've just given me is that X, Y, and Z, and just state what you think. Just tell them what comes to mind, because it's better to let the interviewer understand what you're thinking than to just be silent and to just take a lot of time thinking about it and neither of you really knows what's going on. And my third and final piece of advice is don't be afraid to ask the interviewer and interact with them. Ask them if they think your idea is right. Once you walk them through your framework or your approach to solving a quant problem, ask them, so this is how I'm thinking about it. Does that sound reasonable to you? And oftentimes you'll get some pretty good feedback from the interviewer about whether or not you're heading in the right direction or not. So that's it for this video. I hope you guys found it helpful, and if you liked it, feel free to give it a like, subscribe, or leave a comment in the comments below, letting me know what sort of content you'd like me to put out in the future.